Part 3. Immorality is the consequence of unfairness and inequality. In this final section, I will look at what I consider to be the most significant social symptoms of Western decline, the destruction of the family and the rise of conspiracy theories. It is within the family that the most grotesque manifestations of the West's corrosive ideology of unfairness, inequality and elitism is most profoundly observed. It is also, moreover, why more traditional communities look critically at Western freedom. At one time, the family was a strong unit of interdependence, and whilst it had its shortcomings and the obvious power imbalances between mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, overall the aim of the family was to offer stability and to educate and socialise the next generation. The idea that greater equality might come with the extension of consent-based choice was not wholly ridiculous. If the inherent shortcomings in power and status within and between families could be moderated by applying a more favourable set of moral principles, then everyone would benefit. Fathers could gain a better bond with their children, daughters could learn about male strengths and weaknesses, and sons the same from their mothers. The unit would be stronger, safer, and emotionally healthier. But that didn't happen. Even though the moral principles that underpinned the family became more liberal, tolerant, and accepting from a legal perspective, the unfairness, inequality, and elitism that has bedevilled the world for 10,000 years was simply extended within the context of the family unit. The social context of the family, to be an independent unit, like the social context of the British welfare state, to support the family in crisis, was abandoned in favour of personal self-interest. The interests of children were thrown aside as mothers and fathers, now legally equals, fought to gain preeminence within this increasingly unstable, toxic and ultimately self-defeating institution. For too many mothers and fathers, the state became the provider and the legitimiser for decisions that could only adversely affect children. Children began to experience values of greed and self-interest, manifest in often aberrant behaviours and emotionally charged exchanges between people who only a few years earlier would have been in enraptured ecstasy, consuming each other sexually and emotionally like sweets. The step family was too frequently the step up that often saw biological fathers, and sometimes even biological mothers, tossed aside. It became a norm, created by the worst human characteristics, greed and lust. The potential for collaboration, cooperation and consensus within the family unit thrown aside in favour of a new arrangement based on the ancient horrors of unfairness, inequality and elitism. Of course, it's absolutely necessary to allow divorce and to construct marriage on contracted principles of choice-based consent, capitalism's legacy of freedom. But that is the theory. Devoid of any sense of how that freedom is used or applied personally, the reality is those principles of choice-based consent have been used to open up inequality and unfairness on an almost industrial scale. It is really no surprise that there is a drug misuse and mental health crisis. In addition to the many economic casualties of failing capitalism, so many others are the adults who were the children of relationships based on all the wrong values of unfairness, inequality and elitism. The sad end game of capitalism, therefore, is that it has failed to generate equality based on choice and consent. It has instead reproduced unfairness based on inequality and elitism, which is too often fought out within the family. The solution is easy to identify. Mothers and fathers need to contract thoughtfully, abandon aims of unfairness between themselves and their partners. Inequality and elitism within their relationships needs putting in check, and they should embrace what are essentially humanity's natural instincts to cooperate, collaborate, and achieve consensus within their families. However, until we can see through the fog of personal greed and self-interest, sadly still being gifted to us by failing capitalism, things will remain slow to change. One sad byproduct of the decline of the properly functioning family is the explosion of pornography. On the internet, all peculiarities and tastes are catered for by porn stars who are willing to do whatever necessary to take themselves and their private parts to the porn market as a product consumed by viewers. In exchange for this seemingly freely contracted dehumanisation, devoid of intimacy, they receive either payment, notoriety, or both. Pornography has been around for centuries, but its content and use tells us a lot about our society. As pornography became more mainstream from the 1970s onwards, it became more overtly consensual and less odiously exploitative. Soft pornography magazines had men only at one end of the market, with Razzle at the other end of the UK market. This was probably the point at which pornography was little more than a straightforward commercial transaction that surprised no one and titillated almost everyone. Its less overt manifestations revealing themselves in the genre of films that included the Carry On and Confessions franchises in the UK. That this combination of content, which included Miss World, was condemned by feminists is hardly surprising. Women in the post-Second World War era understood the nature of capitalism as essentially exploitative. These women might be consenting to their activities, but post-war socialism taught women that capitalist consent was always conditional upon the exploiter getting more out of the deal than the contracted, choosing and consenting woman. Socialist thinking in the 1970s would not let capitalism, as it manifested itself in the porn industry, present itself as benign, democratic or egalitarian. In a strange alliance of feminism, Christianity and socialism, women in the porn industry were presented as victims, in much the same way as a worker is seen as a victim of capitalism's confidence trickery of profits over wages. Getting people to consent to their own exploitation is the true extent of economic freedom within the capitalist system. Once it was possible to film pornography relatively cheaply and sell it on video cartridges and then eventually go straight onto the internet, there was no stopping its slide into mass exploitation at what is arguably its most unhinged. People will consent to anything, even dangerous and body-harming sexual activity, and sometimes it's not even clear what level of consent has been acquired before people have their private areas exposed to all manner of abuse. The arguments of the old feminists remain as valid now as then. The difference is the levels of deprivation to which consent and contract apply is now of an almost unimaginable level of weirdness. The other difference is that the women involved are now seen as fully consenting moral agents rather than victims of male commercial oppression. Their moral agency expressed through the free market and all dressed up as a legitimate contract based on choice, but it is not a contract based on real fairness and real equality. Where this will end is anyone's guess, but pornography defines the extent of human sexual preoccupation, and today it's not really about celebrating sex, it's about cold calculating finance, exhibitionism and humiliation. Getting money by trying to resolve the yawning lack of intimacy amongst a growing number of lonely and alienated Western adults, a way of literally stripping people of their human dignity simply to make money. It's no wonder religious extremists see the West as defined by its lax morality and its pornography as an assault on women and the family, easily corrected by making the family subject to God-ordained male, as opposed to free market oppression. Finally, we look at conspiracy. When you consider the West and its debt-based big state corporate authoritarianism, it's not difficult to think that this whole mess is deliberate and intended to benefit the interests of a global elite. The groups that promote conspiracy use terms like Great Reset, the global elite, the Illuminati, and see striking down the white Western working class as an act of actual will by shady groups of individuals, headed up by billionaire philanthropists. It's not difficult to see why. If being poor and mentally ill costs the state money, and suicide is not only legal, but is also promoted in some advanced Western nations, it's not hard to put two and two together to make five. But these conspiracies are little more than the byproducts of fear. The fear of ordinary people who can sense something is wrong in the hyper-normal West and are trying to protect their sense of identity by looking for purpose and planning against their interests by a powerful, shady global class. It makes them believe they are doing something good, maybe by trying to create class consciousness by believing in something bad, a conspiracy. The problem is conspiracies do little to deal with the West's slow, remorseless decline, little to do with the continuation of unfairness, inequality and elitism within a failing system built on these principles, and where the solution of conspiracy theorists is simply to find alternative ways of doing very much the same thing. But conspiracy theorists don't achieve anything, they simply reinforce the interests of a political and economic system still supported by a ruling class. As for the facts, the white Western working class is ageing, failing to reproduce and increasingly impoverished. Consumers and the personally indebted, however, are needed in increasingly large numbers to maintain the global system, so augmentation of the white Western working class is required. It's not replacement of the white Western working class that makes global migration acceptable to the economic and political elite. its survival for the time being of the global economic system. This includes the West's shrinking white working class. So to summarise, over the course of 500 years, a model of economic organisation based on three simple economic and legal principles of contract, choice and consent has risen and is now dying, leaving a lingering legacy of unfairness, inequality and elitism as the world's default business as usual. As capitalism became established, it extended these new legal principles of contract, choice and consent, which began to confer personal freedoms never before allowed in any other society. Now we are seeing capitalism's demise. In the absence of a successful political struggle by ordinary people, these freedoms will look increasingly likely to disappear, leaving only unfairness, inequality and elitism to re-establish their powerful monopoly in the West. People should be frightened of this, as it's rather more frightening than the confected fears of climate change, internet catastrophe, AI and war, etc. The Western elite are trying to stave off the reality of the death of our now failing economic system. They're doing so because they get rich from it. However, to just temporarily stave off the end of the system, certain things are needed, and these are adverse to the interests of ordinary people. These things are mass migration to replace workers who are also consumers and who are declining in number in the West. They also promote a new vision of economic growth based on indebtedness within a free market that undermines family and sexual morality, whilst making us look for an explanation for their failure in the unlikeliest places such as conspiracy websites. All this diminishes every one of us, all of which feeds the peddlers of religious superstition with their morality of unfairness, inequality and elitism based on an abstract God rather than the misery of human greed. Indebtedness destroys lives, wrecks the planet, and will be used to continue to allow a small global elite to get rich. There is no one solution to this problem, but the need is clearly there for ordinary people to become politically aware of the reality that radical change is needed, and to start the slow and relentless task of bringing about the next stage in humanity's social evolution, something we call a blue revolution. Before this can happen, ordinary people need to gain an understanding of how the bad principles of the free market, namely unfairness, inequality and elitism, have been sold to us as common sense by corporations and politicians of all parties everywhere in the world and since the dawn of time. Since then, we've been expected to embrace them as our reality, our common sense, even though they are now slowly beginning to undermine our freedom via wokery and identity politics. The idea that contract, choice and consent, the good aspects of the free market, can become the framework for a new social justice, encouraging an enhanced freedom based on cooperation, collaboration and consensus, is not on the agenda of politicians or the economic elite. So, nothing will change until we change it.